You may have heard the saying, "Don't let a black cat cross your path." In many cultures, black cats have the unfortunate burden of being perceived as unlucky. Even in countries where they are perceived as good luck, such as in Wales, they still retain an aura of the supernatural. You may have also heard that black cats were once believed to be the allies of the devil, and that a church-orchestrated mass killing of cats led to the overpopulation of rats in Europe, and thus the Black Death. Almost none of that story is true. But cats in general were seen as morally dubious creatures, and they feature heavily in the superstitions and imagery that surrounded medieval heretics. Later, they would become the familiars of that most feared woman, the witch. How did this transformation occur? If people didn't decide overnight that black cats were bad luck, then how did an ordinary house pet become an icon of European folklore? And if cats, especially black cats, were seen as morally dubious, how did they survive? I'm Nicole Miras, and this is Fireside Fables. Since ancient times, cats have been associated with magic and mysticism. In ancient Egypt, the goddess Bastet, who was the goddess of fertility and the protector of the home, was depicted with the head of a cat. In Norse mythology, the goddess Freya rode a chariot pulled by two large cats. In Scottish folklore, the cat She is a fairy cat, usually described as having black fur with a white spot on its chest. This fascination with cats stretches into the present. Cats feature prominently in Japanese folklore, from fearsome yokai to good luck charms. In Islamic traditions, it is said that the Prophet Muhammad loved cats. Cats were viewed not as sacred or magical per se, but were well regarded for their cleanliness, purity, and their usefulness in ridding homes of mice. It's in medieval Europe where things start to get complicated for cats. Now, cats were ubiquitous because they were incredibly useful. Cats were necessary for keeping rats and mice at bay. They could be found in farmhouses, grain stores, on ships, in monasteries, castles, you name it. But in the High Middle Ages, cats became increasingly symbolic of deviancy and tied to heretics. An early example comes from around the year 1180 in the writings of Walter Map, who was a courtier of King Henry II of England. His only work that survives to this day is De Nugis Corialum, or Of the Trifles of Courtiers, which contains anecdotes, legends, and court gossip. In one anecdote, he mentions the belief that Satan appeared to his worshippers as a black cat, and to show their devotion, they would kiss him on the bottom. A few years later, around 1195, you'll find another devilish cat in the Vita Sancti Bartholomew Eremite Farnensis that details the life of St. Bartholomew of Farn. Bartholomew battles with the devil, who takes the form of various animals, including a mouse, a lion, an ape, and notably, a cat. So from these examples, we could infer that the idea of the devil turning into a cat was at least part of some local folklore. This concept continued into the 13th century, as did the detail about kissing the cat's bottom. It was also at this point that the church became deeply concerned not with witches, but with heretics. During the 1230s, Pope Gregory IX established a papal inquisition to formally combat heresy, particularly the Cathars and Waldensians. Just as a quick note, if you have no idea who these people are, the Cathars were a sect that was growing in support in southern France and northern Italy. They believed that there was not one God, but two. A God of good, represented by the New Testament, and a God of evil, represented by the Old Testament. Meanwhile, the Waldensians were sort of like proto-Protestants. They were deeply critical of the wealth of the Catholic Church, and they rejected the Pope's authority. In later centuries, the Waldensians would become absorbed into Protestant churches. Anyway, Gregory IX was keen to stamp out these groups, and in his writings, he reiterated the notion of heretics worshiping the devil in the form of a black cat. In 1233, he issued a famous papal bull, Vox in Rama, which details alleged satanic worship in Germany, including the worship of Satan in the form of a black cat, and he urges his bishops to address these conspiracies. Now, you may be wondering two things. Why black cats, specifically? And did this lead to a massacre of cats? Cats were suspicious because they are liminal creatures, not quite domesticated, not quite wild. Cats do what they want. They come and go as they please, and they can never be truly tamed in the way that a dog can be. The color black was, of course, associated with the absence of light. Nighttime, secrecy, concealment. In the darkness of night, a black cat is even harder to find hiding in the shadows. Their nocturnal aura seemed heightened, mysterious, possibly demonic. I should note that at this point in history, this was not a racial thing. Modern conceptions of race, as in the idea of a white person versus a black person, didn't develop until the Renaissance and throughout the early modern period as a result of European colonialism. But in the 1200s, the concept of a black cat being suspicious or linked to the devil didn't have the racial undertones that you might expect from a European living in, let's say, the 1600s. Now, if you're interested in folklore, you may have come across the idea that in response to Pope Gregory's writing, cats were massacred all across Europe. But there is no evidence that any such organized cat killings occurred. Keep in mind that the papal bull would have been read by clerics. It was a direction to bishops to be on high alert for alleged heresies, not for the public to start killing their cats. Which brings me to an important point. Despite the growing suspicion towards cats, particularly black cats, in religious writing, this did not change the necessity of ordinary people keeping a house cat. As I mentioned earlier, house cats were necessary for managing rodent populations. Even in later centuries, when cats started to become the familiars of witches, people still kept cats. Also, because most people at this time were illiterate, we don't know how most people felt about their cats. We are only hearing from a select group of elite voices. But we can probably guess that people held some affection towards their cats. In the early 14th century text, La Chirurgie, the French surgeon Henri de Mondeville makes a snarky comment about how silly peasants are for loving and doting on their elderly dogs, even after they're too old to work. It's a tiny window into how ordinary people saw their pets, in this case, dogs. This is just one example, so I don't want to read too much into it, but I do think that most people saw their cats as more than just rat catchers. I've mentioned this before on the show, but a very common misconception is the idea that witch trials were a medieval phenomenon. In reality, witch trials were uncommon in the medieval world. Folk magic was a nebulous territory, and the church was far more concerned with heretics than they were with witches. Witch trials were overwhelmingly a phenomenon of the early modern period, especially after the Protestant Reformation and spiking between 1550 and 1650. Witch trials and executions were especially common in areas of high instability, such as the Holy Roman Empire. Across Central Europe, you have this bloated empire that is actually a mix of competing states and principalities, with an increasing mix of Protestant and Catholic territories and a hodgepodge of inconsistent legal systems and jurisdictions. You add war and famine on top of that, and you're creating a hotbed of paranoia and declining social trust. Okay, great, but what does this have to do with cats? Well, on the continent, witches were often accused of making a pact with the devil, who usually took human form. Sometimes the devil would attend witches' sabbaths in the form of a cat, but it was in England where the concept of the witch familiar really took off. In this context, a witch's cat was not Satan in disguise, but rather a spirit entity who lived with the witch as a magical companion. Unlike the chaos that was the Holy Roman Empire, England actually had a pretty centralized judicial system. Any accusation of witchcraft had to go through formal courts where they would be scrutinized by judges. A general witchcraft conspiracy wasn't enough. Accusers had to come before the court with specific acts and proof of harm or maleficium, such as death or crop failure. As ridiculous as this might sound to us now, this did result in far fewer executions than what could be found in continental Europe. This centralized judicial process meant that English witch trials relied extensively on witness testimony, which was transcribed in court records, published in pamphlets, and circulated far more easily among the public. Familiars therefore took on a life of their own in the public imagination, and they weren't just cats. Toads were incredibly common, as well as dogs or mice. mice. By the late 1600s, witch trials in Europe faced increased skepticism and, with the Age of Enlightenment, were finally stamped out. So how did the idea of the black witch cat survive the trials? Witch trials may have disappeared in Europe, but as any Fireside viewer knows, folklore persists. The concept of black cats being unlucky lingered. By the late 18th century and into the 19th century, scholars whom we would now call folklorists became increasingly interested in recording the folk beliefs and legends of the masses. This practice then preserved the notion of black cats being omens or harbingers of bad things to come. And of course, the Victorian period saw the renewed interest in magic and the occult, but this time they could be a source of fascination rather than public hysteria. The witch transformed from a criminal in league with the devil into an aesthetic figure, a symbol of mystery and, particularly in the art of the pre-Raphaelites, a femme fatale of the mystical past. It was also in the late 19th century that you see the emergence of modern Halloween in the United States, which blended the folk customs of the Irish and Scottish diasporas with modern commercialism. Greeting cards, postcards, candy. The industrialists behind the making of a mass holiday needed imagery to sell. Witches, jack-o'-lanterns, personified moons, and of course, what could be more visually striking than a black cat? Black cats became a fixture of cards from that era, cementing them as the witch's companion, imagery that can still be found in witchy media to this day. However, the beautiful black fur that makes these animals stand out in illustrations also makes them harder to photograph. To this day, black cats have a harder time getting adopted, as do black dogs. While lingering beliefs about unluckiness could definitely be a factor, researchers who have studied this phenomenon have suggested that the difficulty in photographing them may be a larger problem, as adoptions now are advertised by shelters online, and the animals who photograph more clearly are more likely to get attention. Whatever the case, black cats still retain a supernatural quality. Their mysterious appearance, their ability to better conceal themselves as they prowl around at night, and of course, the fact that a cat can never be truly tamed. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe to the channel and let me know if you have an idea for a future video. Be well, and I'll see you next time.